The following is an AZPM original production.
For AZPM, I'm Mark McLemore, and this is Arizona Spotlight. Coming up, meet Alexander J. Ward, the originator of a podcast called People Helping People Live, forging new connections between members of the Arizona community and organizations that can help make lives better. A new episode of AZPM's Children of the Holocaust focuses on survivor Sidney Finkel and explores the impact that silence, trauma, and resilience can have on second and third generation survivors. And listen to a favorite story as told by Simon Donovan. It's about a dog named Betty. It begins with tears, but ends with laughter. Those stories are next on Arizona Spotlight. About 5 months ago, Alexander J. Ward decided to take what he calls a leap of faith, and he launched a podcast called People Helping People Live. He interviews folks from all walks of life, often with inspirational stories to share, or who want to speak on behalf of a cause that could positively impact the audience. Now with more than 60 episodes recorded and well over 1,000 subscribers, Ward is beginning to feel the power of the platform that he's built. I started by asking him to describe one of the many challenges that he encountered when he began to host People Helping People Live.
Obviously never being an interviewer before. I always enjoyed having incredible conversations with people, in-depth conversations with people. And so for me, it was just about setting up everything that I knew about production, setting up everything I knew about sound, and diving in.
People are always coming up to me and asking about getting started in podcasting. I've got this idea for a show, where do I take it? I don't know what to tell them. The Sphinx, I'm clueless.
The platform for me, I have to just lean on the community. I had support right out of the gates. And being that I run a live show, having those people interact with us live, giving me feedback, hey, your headphones aren't working, or hey, the sound is too low, your soundboard's too hot. And then having guests reach out to also be a part of it is kind of built organically.
So many people want to make a podcast because they want to be the star. But I don't get that vibe from you at all.
Yeah.
You're there to bring in people from the community with interesting and uplifting stories to tell.
Initially, I bought all this gear to just have conversations with my family forever. And that was so exciting to me. How cool would it be to have your grandmother talking, having a full-fledged conversation, laughing, reflecting on everything that she had done in her life? And you have that forever, for generations. I feel as though it evolved into finding purpose in service of others, giving people a platform where they can speak openly, feel heard, and if they're selling something, whether it's a product, or they have a business, or they're a musician or an artist, to give them a platform to express who they are and put a face to those different avenues. And that just, maybe selfishly, just ignites me. It's so exciting. It's so exciting that people feel so good after a conversation.
People often do not realize the value of the wisdom that they carry around in them.
It feels like every guest is immediately a part of our network. And that's the beauty of it, is that when we do have people like Amanda Cardenas, she lends a hand to her beautiful network of type 1 diabetics that she's built over time. When I have artists on the show, they're lending their knowledge and an open ear to anybody else that wants to reach out to them. This is about building out a network where I can connect people that need things. And that's what feels so good, is that every single person that has been on the show has been so head over heels wanting to be involved that connection I have in my back pocket to be able to make for each of those individuals if they need something.
Can you share a little bit about your own personal experience with diabetes and why this cause is important to you?
I was diagnosed late in life, 28 years old, thought I was healthy, was competing in CrossFit and eating healthy, and then all of a sudden, I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes and Crohn's disease, in and out of the hospital for the better half of 2 years. And I had to pull myself out of the mud a lot. As any diabetic knows, it's something that just is all too common. And so I speak about type 1 diabetes openly. I speak about my Crohn's disease openly because I think it's so important for people to see that it's okay to not be perfect. I've had hypoglycemic attacks in the middle of episodes where I'm sweating profusely and I have a guest in studio and I tell them, hold on, I need to go get some honey. I'm not okay. Amanda Cardenas came on to my show and completely changed the way that I looked at everything. Because of the network that she had built out going to Camp ASDA 24 years ago, it went from her, a person alone as a type 1 diabetic in the world, searching for understanding, searching for community, searching for love. And she flipped the script from being somebody who needed that to somebody who found it because of Camp ASDA, then becoming an advocate to sponsor other kids because she was sponsored by somebody they never met. I just think it's beautiful, man. I started a production company prior to that called Type 1 Production, and the goal was to help people with type 1 diabetes, but I couldn't find an outlet. I couldn't find a way to give back. And I know how alone I felt as a type 1 diabetic.
Alexander and I invited Amanda Cardenas to join us by telephone from Phoenix. Cardenas begins by explaining why she is an advocate for Camp ASDA, which is hosted each year in Prescott by the Arizona chapter of the American Diabetes Association.
I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when I was 7 years old. It was one of those things where my parents are like, hey, we have a life-changing diagnosis for not just your child, but for you guys. And not only does it change your life, but it also changes your finances, too. And then as they're telling us about everything, about the life-saving medication that was necessary for me and my diagnosis, but also they're like, by the way, and it costs about the same as it does like a third of your mortgage. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, and by the way, there's this amazing summer camp that's a week long for kids with type 1 diabetes. It's up north. And by the way, it's over $1,000. My dad was somebody who, he's a great networker, and then he was out about a week after this diagnosis. One of the ladies he had met, was kind of like, hey, what's going on? You look a little off. And my dad was like, well, my daughter just got diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. We'd love to send her to this camp, but we just can't afford it. And this woman who, again, I have no idea who she is, what her name is, like this was so long ago, but instead of asking more questions, she just wrote me a check for me to go to this camp. And it was so life-changing. And this woman has no idea, how impactful this was on me. Because when I was first diagnosed, I was told all the things I can't do anymore. And then I go to this camp, and I'm shown all the things that I can do. So for kindness, generosity, and for selflessness, it's gifting me this experience has changed everything for me. So now I build my business around this, where everything that I do in my community, like all the deals I have through my real estate business with the diabetes community, I'm able to donate portions of my money back to help fundraise money to sponsor kids to go to camp and continue to pass on this gift of perspective and community. They meet new friends. They develop these lifelong friendships, which I can attest to. I have friends that I met on my first year at camp when I was 7 years old. When you're able to meet others who are going through the exact same thing as you, and you have those resources of not just supplies, right? Because, let's say I'm out of insulin or I need help with, medical supplies. I have a massive community of people who I can reach out to that can provide these things to me in a moment's notice. So that right there is one of the most valuable aspects. But not only that, it's the emotional tie and the support that you get as well.
Since the two of you have met before and done at least 2 interviews that I know of, what was a takeaway for each of you from those interviews and from that sense of community that could be built between 2 people living with type 1 diabetes, adults in this case?
Prior to meeting Amanda, my whole sole purpose of everything that I was advocating for moving forward was to build out the network that Amanda had built out. So when we met, and she told me about the reason, there was a pinnacle, there was a moment in her life when she was 7 years old that changed everything moving forward. It completely broadened my horizons to what was possible. And I felt so grateful, like this big weight was lifted. I don't have to go out and hit the streets to find these things anymore. She pointed me in that direction. And so I'm eternally grateful.
And Amanda, what was a positive result of being on the People Helping People show with Alexander?
it's the reach that it has. He's developed such a great community just by starting his podcast. And again, I had no idea who he was at first, and I happened to just see him on Facebook with his other friend who is also type 1 diabetic. And as soon as I heard them talking about that, my thumbs couldn't have moved faster. And thankfully, it led literally to this interview, continuously adding on to the community that we're growing here.
Something I picked up on from listening to and watching the podcast was you've chosen to live out loud. You're not hiding the insulin pump that you need to survive. Instead, you call it a conversation starter.
I'm a big believer that vulnerability is actually a strength. And a lot of people are so afraid to talk about what they're going through, or feel like if they do talk about it, that it makes them less than. And for me, what I've noticed when I'm super outspoken and I'm the person that's not afraid to start that conversation, it opens people up to having that I guess permission to not be afraid to talk about what they're going through and help people understand that it's really not that scary, and it's just something to talk about. It's just so important that people know that you're not the only one going through this, and if you felt like you have them, let's talk so you don't ever feel that way ever again.
So for people who want to get involved, people who want to do what you call the next step, the give back, tell us more.
The best way to find us is on YouTube, youtube.com/@ People Helping People Live. And in that, there are descriptions that have the links to places that you can donate that will go directly to sponsoring kids. And the other thing that we're doing on September 29th, which is a Monday, we're having another marathon stream. It's going to be 4 to 6 hours, maybe longer, because so many artists, world-renowned artists, after we've had them on the show, are donating their pieces of art, and we're auctioning everything off.
My guest was Alexander J. Ward, the originator and host of the podcast People Helping People Live. There's a link on the Spotlight page at azpm.org. This week, a new installment of AZPM's Children of the Holocaust, Stories of Survival. The generation that lived through the Holocaust won't be around much longer, but their children and grandchildren continue to live with the legacy of grief and loss. Project producer Laura Markowitz sat down with 3 generations of the Finkel family to explore the multi-generational effects of Holocaust trauma.
Whenever he leaves the house, 93-year-old Sidney Finkel wears his special cap. It says World War II Holocaust survivor. He'll talk to you or any stranger about his experience. But for nearly 50 years, he never told anyone his story. Not his first wife or his second wife, not his children, no one.
You have to remember that at that time, people did not appreciate hearing Holocaust survivors' story. Nobody knows my story because nobody wants to hear it.
My dad didn't talk about it.
That's Sidney's son, Leon.
We just sort of accepted that he doesn't want us to ask.
And his daughter, Ruth Finkel Wade. Growing up, they knew he'd been in the Holocaust.
But there was no real thoughts about what that meant or what he went through. Didn't talk about it, so it wasn't a part of our lives.
But it was, indirectly. Sidney had a hard time with empathy. Ruth says it was difficult to have an emotional connection with her dad.
My dad had to numb his emotions in order to survive.
When she was in her 20s, Sidney came out about having been a secret alcoholic. This was part of his recovery. He used alcohol to cope with his Holocaust trauma and grief. But the big turning point in the Finkel family happened when Ruth was 33 and about to have a child.
We were trying to come up with baby names, and in the Jewish tradition, we often name our children in memory of a loved one that's no longer with us. And I knew my grandparents' names, but I didn't really know anything about them. And so I asked my dad to tell me about them. Instead, he said, well, I'm going to send you something. And so he sent me a claimant document, which is what survivors fill out in order to get restitution from Germany. So it's a kind of a testimony. I'm reading this thing, and I think this is when I really start to realize that my dad's this Holocaust survivor thing. And there's 2 aunts that I have that I've never heard of, and all of this information. So I called him, and I said, okay, now I have even more questions.
And I was nervous, but I told him the total story.
It was the first time he'd told anybody. He was 7 years old when Germany invaded his town in Poland. Sidney survived bombings, the ghetto, slave labor, cattle cars, concentration camps, a death march, weeks of exposure and starvation on an open train car at the very end of the war. When he was liberated in 1945, he was 12 years old, an orphan who couldn't read. He was emotionally numb and only knew how to steal food and get into fights. His body eventually healed, but no one helped him with the emotional scars. In fact, he was told to forget about it and move on.
I was stunned. Yeah, I called my brother afterwards and talked to him about it.
I heard my dad's story with a bunch of 12 and 13-year-olds for the first time.
What happened was a friend of Leon's had asked if Sidney would be willing to come and talk to his class.
I remember listening to the story and then just sitting in my car for hours afterwards and somehow having to go back to work after that.
And then the Holocaust Museum, the U.S. Museum, opened in April of that year, 1993.
We all went to the museum and we walked through the museum for about 5 hours. So we learned more about our family history in those 5 hours, way more than anything we ever knew before. As we're walking through the museum, whether it was a picture or an artifact, everything prompted a memory for my dad.
But not really emotional. And then they had a cattle car that you walk through to get from one side to the other. We step onto that, and he just lost it. I mean, he had a complete meltdown, sobbing. We all, put our arms around him and guided him off.
But then we sat out in the mall in Washington for a couple hours and talked about what it was like growing up, not knowing anything, and how great it was for Dad to be able to share this with us.
Dad made us talk about our feelings. I wanted to be more involved with that.
And you were.
And I was.
Ruth started to connect with other children of survivors, and eventually she co-edited an anthology. It's called The Ones Who Remember, Second-Generation Voices of the Holocaust. The writers describe how their parents' Holocaust experiences affected them. Waking up in the middle of the night to their parents' screams, parents who hoarded food, parents who force-fed them. Many of the parents struggled with clinical depression, debilitating anxiety, and complicated grief.
There are people who were overprotected by their parents. There were people that were underprotected by their parents. There were parents who talked about it from the time they were too young.
Either there were survivors that would talk about nothing else, or there were ones like me that wouldn't talk about it. I didn't want to burden my kids with horror stories.
But his thoughts about that changed. So remember that talk he gave to the history class?
I was amazed how interested the kids were. I felt that I had something, that was valuable.
So from that point on, talking about the Holocaust became his mission. He's told his story to thousands of students. He wrote a memoir for middle schoolers. It's called Sevek and the Holocaust, The Boy Who Refused to Die. He's distributed more than 30,000 copies. So while his own children didn't hear his story until they were adults, Sidney's grandchildren grew up hearing it often.
His story is so embedded in my life growing up.
That's Leon's daughter, Barry Finkel.
Since I was very little, would go with him to hear him speak and introduce him to students. Papa's story is so compelling in the way that he tells it, and why it sounds weird, but loved hearing it because it's so much about him as a little boy.
His story also traumatized her in some ways.
I grew up in a very privileged, loving home and have at times debilitating anxiety and a lot of intrusive, obsessive thoughts that a lot of times were about parts of Papa's story.
She struggles with OCD, depression, and anxiety. Barry believes epigenetics may be a factor.
The ways in which trauma can change genetics and pass down to, several generations from the actual trauma.
Research shows that children and grandchildren of survivors of any trauma, not just the Holocaust, can experience something called inherited memory trauma. So even though it's not their direct experience, knowing what happened to parents or grandparents can cause higher levels of anxiety and depression and increased sensitivity to potential threats.
Like, this is a part of who I am in such a deep way. There's just never a childhood in which I didn't think about my grandpa's childhood.
That's Becca Miller. She's Barry's sister. She says she's had nightmares throughout her life about Nazis.
There are two feelings I feel the most when I hear Grandpa's story, and one of them is a terrifying, debilitating fear, and the other is an enormous pride.
Pride in being a Jew, pride in her family, and pride in being a third-generation survivor. Stories of survival invite listeners to bear witness, not only to the suffering, but also to the acts of kindness, courage, resilience, and forgiveness.
We just have this infinite ability to care about each other. And I think that's bigger than any of the ugliness. I do. Maybe not by much, but it's bigger.
Yeah, I agree. She's right.
For Arizona Spotlight, this is Laura Markowitz.
To view full-length interviews with Sidney Finkel and other survivors living in southern Arizona, you can visit the Children of the Holocaust page at azpm.org. There's something powerful about a single voice sharing a true story. It gives a chance for the storyteller to let their personality shine and forge new connections with anyone who listens. In support of this important community tradition, Arizona Spotlight is featuring a different storyteller on the third Thursday of every month. Here's Tony Paniagua to introduce us to our special guest.
Thank you, Mark. Our storyteller this month is Simon Donovan. He is a well-known and prolific multimedia artist behind projects such as the Rattlesnake Bridge on Broadway Boulevard and several other public artworks in Tucson and other cities. His story takes place more than 20 years ago, but it still brings vivid memories and emotions.
When my partner David and I moved to Tucson from Boston, we adopted a dog from the Humane Society. A year-old stray, her name was unknown, so we started calling out random names, and when I said Betty, she cocked her head to the side the way dogs sometimes do, and so Betty it was. Betty is what I've come to refer to as the common Arizona brown dog, which is essentially a mutt. But she was beautiful, like a little golden-haired doe with black eyeliner. And Betty was really smart and well-behaved, and so incredibly sweet. Everyone loved Betty, even my parents, who generally didn't like dogs. They took care of her for a month once when we were traveling, and they didn't want to give her back. I think experiencing dog love is important. It's an uncomplicated, unconditional love. And one day, after having Betty for 14 years, I came home from work, and as I was entering the front walk, I could hear David inside the house screaming, "Betty, no! Oh, please, Betty, no!" And I rushed into the house to find him on the floor holding her as she shuddered in his arms and then died. It was devastating. I could not stop crying. A couple of hours later, my friend Bob called on the phone. Bob had moved away from Tucson a few years prior. I said, "Bob, before we start talking, I have to tell you I'm really, really upset because Betty just died unexpectedly." Bob was a dog person, so I knew he'd understand. He said, "Oh my God, Betty?" "Yes, Betty." Now, what I neglected to remember is that Bob and I had a mutual friend named Betty O'Grady. Betty O'Grady was older and rather heavy-set, and so he just assumed when I said Betty, I meant Betty O'Grady. Had she been ill? No, she's been fine. I mean, getting older, but she seemed the same as ever. And she just died. Yeah, about 2 hours ago. Oh my God, how did you find out? When I came home, she was on the floor by the front door, and David was holding her. She was struggling to breathe, and then she just died. What? She died in your house? In front of you? Oh my God. I know. I think she was just waiting for me. I was so glad to just be there in time to kiss her head and to say that I loved her. Was it a heart attack? Maybe. I mean, it was a really hot day. David said she had been out on the patio. Did you do CPR? We didn't even think of that. What do you mean? So you just called an ambulance? Huh? You can do that? Oh my God. I don't understand. Then what did you do? Well, we picked some flowers from the garden, and we wrapped her with the flowers in this beautiful Indian bedspread, and then we buried her in the yard. What? You are sick! And Bob slammed down the phone. I stood there, confused. About a minute later, Bob called back. You were talking about your dog, Betty, and not Betty O'Grady, huh? We now have Blondie, our 5th dog since Betty. The loss of a dog does not get easier, but I still think having dog love in my life is fundamental.
That was Simon Donovan. He's a multimedia artist who discovered storytelling a couple of decades ago and has become a huge fan of this social and cultural activity. For Arizona Spotlight, I'm Tony Paniagua.
Thank you for listening to Arizona Spotlight. This show is a production of AZPM. The production engineer is Jim Blackwood. I'm producer and host Mark McLemore.
AZPM podcasts are made possible in part by donations from listeners like you. Learn more at support.azpm.org. Thank you.